The Beatles entered January 1969 exhausted after 8 years of chart domination. On January 2nd, they began filming what would become the Get Back, Let It Be project at Twickenham Film Studios in St. Margaret's, guided by director Michael Lindsay Hogg and a small film crew, with recording overseen by engineer Glyn Johns. Their longtime producer, George Martin, was largely absent. Tensions were visible from the start. John Lennon arrived with Yoko Ono, Paul McCartney pushed for structured rehearsals and a public performance, and George Harrison grew quiet and resentful, briefly walking out in mid-January. Instead of the usual studio magic, their instruments and amps sat under bright lights and rolling cameras, creating a sense of creative paralysis. The band decided to relocate to Apple Corps headquarters at 3 Savile Row, seeking a more domestic, golden age atmosphere and a chance to recapture live spontaneity. The plan was simple: strip away overdubs, rehearse songs in front of cameras, and then play them live, possibly for an audience, to rediscover the immediacy that had defined their early career. That idea, a public performance as a cure, raised the stakes and built raw anticipation. The gamble could either restore them or expose them, and it set the tone for everything that followed. When cameras arrived at the Twickenham sessions, they turned rehearsal into a harsh vaudevillian spotlight that revealed fissures instead of miracles. From January 2nd, 1969, the band worked under director Michael Lindsay Hogg and engineer Glyn Johns amid rolling film cans and glaring studio lamps that made rehearsal feel more like interrogation. John Lennon always came with Yoko Ono, and her presence became a constant provocation to fault lines that had been widening for months. Paul McCartney pushed for disciplined, polished rehearsals and public-ready standards. George Harrison, a quiet craftsman, kept getting interrupted and talked down to. Frustration reached a peak, and George walked out on January 10, 1969. A stark, fateful break that exposed how fragile the project had become and how alienated he felt. For 6 days, the group splintered behind closed doors. George returned on January 16th, after talks and reluctant concessions, but the atmosphere stayed brittle and more noir than buoyant. Paul, tired of plastered takes and endless second-guessing, argued for a cure. Stop hiding behind overdubs and stage a live performance to force the chemistry back into the room. Subscribe. Maybe that would have kept them together. His idea was practical and theatrical. Strip the songs to their bones, rehearse in the domestic intimacy of Apple Corps at 3 Savile Row, then play them in front of cameras and perhaps a crowd. That push reshaped the plan, precipitated the move to Apple on January 20th, 1969, and set a clear, high-stakes objective that focused rehearsals and led to a single public experiment. When Paul McCartney pushed for a public test, the idea hardened into a surprise gig on the flat roof of Apple Corps at 3 Savile Row, set for January 30th, 1969. The plan was pragmatic: a brief, brassy set filmed by Michael Lindsay Hogg's crew and recorded by the Apple/EMI engineers, loud enough to rouse pedestrians, but short enough to be an impromptu experiment. Logistics moved fast. Microphones, amplifiers, Ringo Starr's Ludwig drum kit, John Lennon's Epiphone, and Paul's Hofner bass had to be carried into the inner courtyard and up to the roof. Cables, stands, and a portable PA were run across the parapet, while camera operators rigged platforms and a camera ran inside for close-ups. Billy Preston, who had already been playing on January sessions, was formally invited to join on electric piano to thicken the sound and steady the band's rough edges. His contribution later earned the single credit with Billy Preston. Rehearsals at Apple boiled down to a tight set. Multiple takes of Get Back, then Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling, one after 909 and Dig a Pony, each song paired back to essentials for live delivery. The prospect of a real city audience sharpened their playing. Tempos tightened, call and response vocals snapped into place, and solos were trimmed to decisive statements, but it also exposed fractures. Leadership skirmishes between Paul and John flared over arrangements and who would call a run. George Harrison bristled when decisions defaulted to McCartney, and Yoko Ono's presence continued to unsettle fans of the old chemistry. The roof rehearsal was both galvanizing and combustible, setting the stage for a public experiment that would force everything into daylight. On January 30th, 1969, the four climbed through a skylight onto the flat roof of Apple Corps at 3 Savile Row, instruments and amps hauled up by roadies while camera platforms and cables were fixed in the thin winter air. They launched into a raw, sunlit barrage, a ragged first take of Get Back that crackled with Paul McCartney's blunt bass and John Lennon's sneering vocal, George Harrison's piercing guitar lines slicing through, Ringo Starr's steady Ludwig pulse, and Billy Preston's warm electric piano fills. Pedestrians, office workers, and shoppers gathered on the street below, craning their necks and applauding as the band ran through Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling, One After 9:09, and Dig a Pony, often returning to Get Back in repeated urgent takes. Cameras captured ecstatic grins, spontaneous ad-libs, a shouted cue, and a small laugh between takes. Moments of bright, gilded magic, then tightened on fatigue. John's flickering attention, Paul's brittle insistence on structure, George's terse retakes, and Ringo's calm but weary timekeeping. Yoko Ono stood nearby, a constant presence who polarized reactions. The film crew under Michael Lindsay Hogg preserved every glance and offhand tension. The crowd swelled. The sound rolled into the West End and drew the attention of the Metropolitan Police after noise complaints. About 42 minutes after the first chord, an inspector asked them to lower the volume. They finished with a truncated, emphatic, "Get back," the final notes ringing across Savile Row. The rooftop set delivered palpable musical electricity and interpersonal strain, a public, gilded experiment that felt at once cathartic and fracturing, the last live, unvarnished proclamation from a band already racing toward a decisive rupture. 42 minutes into the sunlit siege of sound on January 30th, 1969, atop Apple Corps at 3 Savile Row, a Metropolitan Police inspector climbed onto the roof and asked the band to lower their volume, bringing the impromptu concert to an abrupt electric halt. The interruption crystallized every tension, the exhilaration of playing live, the brittle leadership tussles between Paul McCartney and John Lennon, George Harrison's contained frustration, and a weary acceptance that this public experiment was also a public reckoning. Michael Lindsay Hogg's cameras and the Apple/EMI recording equipment captured it in close-up and on film. Paul McCartney, voice bright with defiant humor, delivered the memorable valedictory line, "I would like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we passed the audition." The quip landed like a gilded curtain call, part joke, part defense, part elegy, and the Beatles answered with a clipped, emphatic take of Get Back before the amplification was cut. The final chords, filmed faces, and the dispersed crowd captured a paradox, a triumphant last public act that also signaled a tacit acceptance that their collective path was shifting irreversibly toward dissolution. After the climactic rooftop performance on January 30th, 1969, the scene became the keystone image of the sessions. Its footage anchored Michael Lindsay Hogg's Let It Be film and the Let It Be album, released in May 1970. Phil Spector's March 1970 production choices, adding orchestral overdubs to The Long and Winding Road and giving the record a glossy mix, deepened existing fault lines and hastened the group's unraveling, which culminated in Paul McCartney's April 10, 1970 press announcement that he was leaving the band. The Rooftop crystallized a simple but powerful story, a group that could still summon live electricity, yet could not reconcile studio visions, disputes over authorship, or personal rifts. Culturally, the set inspired other live on-location recordings, turned 3 Savile Row into a pilgrimage site, and left the Rooftop as a gilded touchstone in debates about creativity, fame, and endings.